This is Octave Leap. Innovation, regeneration, and human optimization.
Hello and welcome to the Octave Leap live stream. I'm so happy to be back with you guys because we're going to be talking about some really, really cool stuff today. This has been sort of one of my latest fascinations, mostly because it's actually something I've been using. And I've discovered some very, very interesting things about the larger economic global picture and also about my own sort of currency and cryptocurrency trading experience using financial astrology. So today is going to be an action-packed episode, and at the end of it, I'm going to give you a little cool tidbit of a strategy that you can begin to use this yourself. This is really beginner-friendly, by the way, the strategy I'm going to give you, but a way you can use financial astrology if you're, maybe trading cryptocurrencies. Okay, so let's dive in. So astrology is basically kind of the quantum correlation of planets to human consciousness, or consciousness, I should say, because in astrology, everything that begins at a certain time and place has a natal chart, so it has a birth chart. And astrology also assumes that everything in creation is conscious, meaning it has its own personality and its own sort of unique characteristics. And it might be a form of consciousness that is different to how we are accustomed to thinking, right? So businesses, when they're incorporated, the incorporation date and location gives that business a certain astrological chart. And same thing with commodities or stock markets. The first trade of a commodity or the first trade on a stock market and the location often give its how it sort of performs from a financial perspective. Of course, the incorporation, all the paperwork and all the signing of that gives another type of chart that might be related to its fundamentals or its business identity. So the interesting thing here is if you're in marketing, you could use a business incorporation chart that may hold very valuable resources for our information and branding information for identity and keywords around that business. So you can actually go in and look at the natal chart of your small business or another business, and you could maybe pull things out of that chart that might pertain and uncover and unravel sort of these deeper layers of identity associated with the business. It's pretty cool. And I think, maybe some more esoteric marketing consultants may actually be doing that out there. I do know a few people that have gone to see astrological consultants for their business, and they've had some fabulous results. Okay, now if you're an investor, the birth chart for your index or commodity may give clues on how that index or commodity will behave. Like I said, there's an incorporation chart, so the creation, the signing, the paperwork. So for instance, in the US, many equities and stocks, they get signed off in Delaware. So their inception would be in Delaware. However, like the New York Stock Exchange, obviously that the first trade of that happened in New York on a certain date when trading opened. So there's two different charts here. And when we're talking about the price performance, we tend to go with the first trade. So the first trade kind of signifies the inception of that particular chart that we're looking at, whether it be a market, a commodity, a cryptocurrency, whatever. And we're going to take a look at a couple of those today. Okay, so what do actual astrologers look at when they're examining these charts? Well, I mean, the chart will give you some information about the personality or the characteristics of your currency, your commodity, your index. But more importantly, especially around timing, is the transits. And the transits are basically how the sky is moving around us in relation to that static natal chart. Okay, so if things are happening in the sky, like certain planets like Saturn and Jupiter, they form what are called aspects, and aspects could be harmonious or they could be not so harmonious. Now, to give you an idea of how important these are and how much they can directly correlate, Saturn and Uranus can often be very disruptive planets when it comes to financial activity, because Saturn is structure and Uranus is like a lightning bolt. And I've talked about this in some previous shows, that when these two interact, especially when it's a negative interaction, like a square or an opposition, it's kind of like the Tower card in tarot. So it's kind of like the lightning bolt that smashes down our semblance of structure. So yeah, it usually creates problems. And two examples of that in recent history are Saturn opposed Uranus in 2008. And of course, whenever I say 2008, we all think of the global financial crisis, the collapse of the housing market in the US. That was directly Saturn and Uranus oppose each other. That was a very big crash. Another crash was Saturn square Uranus. So Saturn, of course, moves, it does a full circle once every 28 years. So every 7 years, it's going to have a different aspect to Uranus. And a square is more like squaring off, whereas opposition is much more of a hard aspect. So when it squared Uranus, it actually was around the time of the dot-com crash. So believe it or not, there's a huge direct correlation between these two planets. So looking at them can be very telling of what might come. So the outer planets typically give us more of a long-term indication of things. And when we're looking at short-term planets, we want to look at the transits of the inner planets. So the Sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars. That's right. So basically, a short-term indicator might be, okay, Bitcoin might go up today because there's a harmonious aspect of one of these inner planets. Okay, so this could be a day where we see some positive price activity. Okay, so in this live stream, I'm going to show you, we're going to dive into the history of financial astrology, some fascinating case studies around the history, and also I'm going to show you how I use financial astrology to trade crypto. I'm also going to share with you guys my my trading log. So I'm going to show you how well it's worked. I've been using this new technique I developed for the last 26 days. So I'll actually show you the performance that's had using this, and I'll just be very sort of transparent about what's worked and what hasn't. But it is actually working out quite well. And at the end, like I said, I'm going to give you a simple strategy you can use for investing in Bitcoin that doesn't require any fancy analysis and uses some of these techniques from financial astrology. So I hope you find this live stream to be very interesting. And yeah. Okay, so I'm going to start out with the history. So I think astrology, has probably been used for financial endeavors for a long, long time, but it just hasn't really been on the record, because astrology is well documented to have been used in the ancient world. So in ancient Greece, in ancient Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in India, as well as in the medieval world. So it would be very common for, courts to have an astrologer on hand to predict economic, political, and military outcomes. So this is something that, we've seen, and even medieval astrology is extremely, extremely detailed and complicated. I mean, it is a science. In fact, medieval astrology is more complicated than modern astrology. But when we're specifically talking about financial astrology in the way that we use it today, documentation shows that it became popular in the modern world in the US during the late 1800s, around the time that the Dow Jones began. So in 1896 was the launch of the Dow Jones, and basically once that index began, it tripled the trading volume of the New York Stock Exchange within 3 years. So this was a pretty boom period in history, and everyday retailers were buying stocks, and people were getting very excited about this. Another thing around this time, this is very important to note, that astrology was quite in vogue. This is a time in history when humanity was really opening up to the unseen world. We're talking about the post-Victorian era, when seances, channeling, fortune tellers were hot, and in no small part due to the popularization of theosophy from Helena Blavatsky and it's sort of its counterparty, anthroposophy, founded by Rudolf Steiner. I've talked about this before. Actually, at this point in history, around the turn of the 20th century, human consciousness was expanding massively. And in many ways, that continued until World War I broke out, until the Spanish flu broke out. So it goes to show that, the forces that are around today were also around back then, trying to inhibit the inevitable evolution of humanity. So in this sort of early 20th century landscape of finances and people investing in the stock market, there was a fellow named William Delbert Gann, and I've got him here on the stream. There we go. That's William Delbert Gann, and this guy was an absolute brilliant mind. W.D. Gann was a firm believer in natural law, and he really held an esoteric outlook on life. He was actually a 33rd degree Freemason, and whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, it doesn't matter. I've actually had relatives that were part of Freemasonry. I did a whole series of episodes on Freemasonry back in the Blade and Chalice podcast. Actually, I'll get Michaela to put some links to those if you want to hear them. But of course, Freemasonry is a very beautiful lineage of natural law. It's just been hijacked over the years by, the forces that are party poopers and kind of hijacked everything. So, there are positive aspects to it. It does teach us about natural law, and there are certain lineages that are unadulterated. I don't know about now, but definitely at the beginning of the 20th century, around the time of, when W.D. Gann was studying, Rudolf Steiner was a double Freemason, Manly P. Hall. I mean, it was a different landscape back then. These were people that were looking to understand the mechanics of reality, as opposed to trying to be part of some, secretive brotherhood trying to take over the world type of thing. I think that's sort of a inversion of Freemasonry that happened around that time, that began happening. Albert Churchward actually wrote about this quite prevalently. He was warning how Freemasonry was taking on a new angle around the beginning of the 20th century. So I think that plays a role here, and I don't think it's a negative thing. So W.D. Gann began trading at 24, and he developed complex forecasting methods based on astronomy, astrology, and ancient geometry and ancient mathematics. Kind of sounds like the quadrivium that was used in the ancient world. Those were, of course, the four main ancient sciences that they studied in the ancient temple universities of Kemet. So, he was very tuned into this sort of frequency of, like the Fibonacci, the golden ratio, and how they apply to, stock markets being an extension of a natural cycle, because it's mass human consciousness that's basically participating. When you get enough people in a group together, they kind of behave predictably, if you've noticed. Mob mentality, there's tons of studies of this in the early 30s. There's a collective consciousness or collective unconsciousness that forms. So W.D. Gann really came to notoriety in 1909 based on a call that September wheat futures in Chicago would trade at $1.20 per bundle before the contract expired on September 13th, 1909. And this forecast really appeared unlikely. So it was kind of like one of those things where, it was 10% below what he called until like the final hours of trading. And then all of a sudden it just shot up. And that's where the price closed that day. And people were absolutely astounded. Now, he actually went on to develop a number of techniques that actually get used today. So, I mean, the work that he's done, it still gets used by technical analysts today. And he actually did a lot more than just astrology, but he incorporated astrology in with different forms of technical analysis as well. As you can probably see from this chart, there's not a lot of planets, but there's a lot of lines and candlesticks on there. Okay, so this isn't the only character that we're going to be taking a look at. I'm also going to show you somebody else here. Just got to get my... Okay. So Evangeline Adams. Now, this is where things get quite interesting. So Evangeline Adams was a high-profile astrologer at the end of the 19th century. And she actually decided one day she was going to start looking at, the financial world. So she took a look at the stock market and basically predicted a bear market was going to happen in the fourth quarter of 1899. Sure enough, there was an event. The Produce Exchange Trust Company failed, towards the end of 1899, and it brought the markets down by 23%. So a bear market did indeed happen. Now, this accurate call gained the attention of a very important American industrialist, J.P. Morgan, who nowadays is sort of memorialized through his bank, J.P. Morgan Chase, which is one of these monolithic circular investment things, along with BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street. They're all sort of this one giant entity. So I'm not saying this guy was a saint by any stretch, actually quite the contrary, but he was definitely interested in astrology, and actually there's more to the story than that we're going to get into here. So he recruited Evangeline to advise him on a number of important business and financial decisions. And she actually wrote a biography that I'm showing here called The Bowl of Heaven. And in this biography, there's a passage here. So from this Bowl of Heaven, she wrote, "I do know about the late J.P. Morgan's belief in astrology because, well, I taught it to him. I read his horoscope many times and furnished him during the last years of his life a regular service explaining the changing position of the planets and their probable effect on politics, business, and the stock market. No further proof of his interest in the science is required beyond the fact that he renewed this service from year to year." So he kept renewing her contract. The first time he came to her studio, his attitude was frankly one of curiosity tinged with suspicion. I had a heavy Chinese screen in one corner of my studio, and I remembered how Mr. Morgan pulled his huge frame out of his chair and looked curiously behind the screen before beginning the interview. But that attitude melted away at the first meeting, and in his last years he asked me from Egypt to join him and his party in the Orient, where he had gone on his famous yacht, the Corsair. His idea was to spend several months in a scientific investigation of the occult in those parts of the world where its practices reached back into prehistoric time. I declined the invitation, not because I didn't appreciate the opportunity, but because I preferred to pursue my own investigations instead. Quite interesting here. So you can see that this is something that we're obviously not told about. We're never this stuff's never really talked about, and it's kind of laughed about in mainstream science, and academics and the news and media often make fun of astrology, or they sort of downplay it into this sort of personality level. But you can see that there is interest, and this is only what we know, and understanding that a lot of this use of astrology happened in meetings that we're not privy to and were never recorded. So there's probably a lot more to this story than we're seeing. This is just a bit of evidence from somebody's autobiography. Now, you probably want to know how else this can be used, because one thing for me personally, when I looked at this, I'm like, this is fascinating to read these stories, but I want to actually get into the nuts and bolts of how this is actually used. So, short term, we can use the 5 inner planets, like I was saying, the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, on both the first trade chart of a stock, equity, cryptocurrency, and also the transits. And they're basically the ones fast enough to be sensitive to how planets in the sky are affecting the people who are making and buying and sell decisions. So the movement of these planets versus the commodity versus the people looking at the commodity, there's an interplay of energy that a lot of investors are unconscious to, and it actually begins to pull on them and pull on their emotions and drive them to do things in different ways. Long term, though, we have to look at the outer planets, so Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And again, we look at the transit chart and the first trade chart for a commodity. And these may predict longer seasons, such as bull markets, bear markets, crashes, and also maybe unexpected pumps, like what W.D. Gann said. He's like, you're going to see, this thing's going to end at $1.20 per bundle by this date. And sure enough, there's an unexpected pump that pumped beautifully right into that. So all of this comes down to the aspects formed between the transits and the natal chart. Generally in astrology, squares, oppositions are considered to be challenging or negative, and trines and sextile aspects are considered to be positive. So what are these? So opposition is when two planets are 180 degrees from each other. A square is when they're 90 degrees and they form this and they square off. A trine is a harmonious. It's like the edge of an equilateral triangle. So it's a 120 degrees, and then a sextile is half of that. So that's 60 degrees essentially. So let's jump into some charts. Let's actually take a look at how we can use this right now. And yeah, let's have some fun with this. So I'm going to dive in here. And this is the Dow Jones chart. So you can see 1896, May 26th was its first day of trade, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's basically when it launched. And, you know, I haven't really taken a look at the Dow Jones too much, so I don't work with it. But you can see this chart is a Gemini, and it's got a lot of placements in Gemini. So it's got a lot about communication around short-term networking, those type of elements. It's also got some hidden aspects to it as well. Uranus and Saturn in the sign of Scorpio over here. And you could almost call this a conjunction, meaning that sort of unexpected. Remember what I said about Saturn and Uranus? That tends to make financial markets explode. So you can see that the Dow Jones might be involved in some larger economic explosions. And we've definitely seen that over the years. The crash of 1929 sent, the world into a Great Depression. The crash of 2008 sent, again, the world into a Great Recession. Okay, so another one that I do follow is the NASDAQ, and these are the tech stocks. And so the NASDAQ launched February 8th, 1971 in New York City, New York at 10 a.m. And the interesting thing here is Aquarius is often the sign of innovation, the genius, technology, forward thinking, the future. And you can see it's got the sun and the north node in the 11th house. So this is really bringing large groups of people together around the future, these stocks, these companies. So, whether you like to think I'm going to remove any judgment of whether they're good or bad and just talk about sort of the energies behind them, because for better or for worse, this is what they're doing, is they're bringing people into the future, literally. And that's sort of where the direction of it. It's taking people out of their own personal expression, their need to express themselves, and allowing them to do so, and allowing them to shine forth with their life force into this. So this is sort of how the NASDAQ's personality is. And if you've seen the movie or read the book American Gods, you can almost see these forces, these large forces being personified as a person. And I think it's a great analogy for the consciousness behind some of these different things that we don't think are conscious, like, stock markets, for instance. So this is, again, is just an example of another natal chart. And of course, this is Bitcoin. And, in Bitcoin's chart, again, you see a tremendous amount of Aquarius energy, tremendous amount. So North Node in Aquarius, the Mercury in Aquarius. So the way we think about it is very technologically driven, very forward thinking driven. And, the interesting thing is it's got a Uranus in Pisces. So it's sort of shattering, in a way, the old age of Pisces paradigms, that of the anointed and the unclean, or that of the ones who know and the masses, essentially. So it's shattering that paradigm, but it's also got a direct opposition to Saturn here. So interesting to see that when we looked at the Dow Jones had a conjunction of Uranus and Saturn. Bitcoin is here to disrupt, folks. I mean, it's got an opposition between these two. It's going to be the Tower card in its plight, and it's still a teenager. I mean, it's 13 years old, so it's still very young. Here we see a tremendous amount of Capricorn energy too, but with Pluto in Capricorn, that is more transforming the institutions, metamorphosizing the system in a way. And Jupiter is taking sort of the wisdom of finance, the wisdom of knowledge, and it's knocking at the door, moving it into Aquarius here in the 7th house. So those are just an example of, very quick readings of these different, commodity indexes and of course, Bitcoin. Other thing that's interesting here is the Aries moon, very fast moving, very fast initiatory force. And if you've seen Bitcoin when it pumps, I mean, it runs faster than any stock market we've ever seen. When it wants to go, it's going to go. When it wants to crash, it's going to crash. It's going to do it hard. that's very much symbolized by the Aries moon. All right, now this is here how we can begin to look at some of these transits. So I actually pulled it for today. This is not financial advice. Anything I tell you here in the next 20 minutes, it's not financial advice. I'm not telling you to go out and invest. I'm actually just going to point out a couple things that are happening right now. But we have the one that really catches my eye here is the transiting Mars. And this is happening in a couple hours, I think. Transiting Mars is trining the natal Mars in Bitcoin. And so Mars, again, is like that Aries, is that initiatory force. Because Mars is correlated with Aries, and Aries is where Bitcoin's moon is, we might see a little pump. You know, it's not major, it's two inner planets, but we might see a little pump happening later when that aspect actually comes into alignment. It's not quite there yet today. It's going to happen in a couple hours. Other things going on, and this is more long-term, but we have Uranus and the North Node squaring off with Chiron. So very much showing weaknesses. It's bringing up a lot of weaknesses with cryptocurrency, but this is this is a slower moving thing. So this is sort of like exposing some of the dark side of cryptocurrency. Some of the weaknesses, some of the shadow aspects are coming to light through this, because Chiron, of course, is the wounded healer. So if we're going to go into the future, we need to basically heal our wounds from the past first. We can't just basically plop ourselves into this future frequency without actually dealing with the shadow side that's been haunting us for a long time and we've been carrying with us. And the interesting thing too is that whenever the North Node, the transiting North Node, the South Node is also going to form it. So this is really highlighted right now because it's squaring off with the nodes. So if Bitcoin's going to have a future, we actually have to deal with this chironic element. Now, I could go in forever on this, and I could write a thesis about it, and I'm not going to do that because this is more of a philosophical discussion at this point. You know, if you're wondering about short-term price action, it's not going to tell us. It's going to tell us we're probably in a season of challenge, which we are. But beyond that, it's not going to tell us much for the short term. This Mars trining Mars is saying today we might see a little bit of price action in the upward direction. Okay, so that's just a look at how we actually interpret the transits versus an equity, which in this case is actually not an equity, it's a cryptocurrency. Now let's take a look at some long-term stuff here. So in the long-term elements, we have, I talked a little bit about this last week, but I want to kind of dive into it again in case you didn't see it, or kind of dive into it with a little bit more background. But this is the NASDAQ, and this is sort of more of a forecast. You can see 2022, September, October, November, December. So this is later in the year. So this is what I would call a long-term thing. So I'm not really looking at what Mars or what Venus or what these inner planets are doing. I'm looking for these larger things. And actually this is based on the interpretation of another astrologer, Star Magi, who I would highly recommend you check out his stuff. I'm actually going to try to get him on the show, by the way. I'm going to try to interview him here because he's a really cool guy. He's a friend of Vanessa's, and he's just, I love listening to his stuff. So anyway, he's saying that Saturn conjunct the Sun is happening between September and November. So that's going to be one we're going to want to watch out for. So that is challenging because, like I said, conjunctions could be positive or negative. Conjunctions tend to amplify the energy of both things. So Saturn is restriction, Saturn is external authority, and the Sun is life force, vitality, wanting to move in its own direction. And so when those two get there, that's basically when we're going to see probably some sort of a challenge. This is the NASDAQ, the tech stocks, between innovation and the old system that's going to cause problems. Now, we also have Jupiter opposed Pluto, which is basically the planet of expansion and the planet of death and rebirth, pulling in a tug of war. Again, quite a challenging aspect. And finally, we're going to have a Uranus, transiting Uranus, conjunct the natal Saturn. And whenever there's problems, you can bet Uranus and Saturn are involved in financial astrology. So we're going to actually have a conjunction later this year. So this is where I'm going to be a little bit concerned towards the end of the year about the stock market and the larger economy, which of course isn't looking very good. So, as somebody who can interpret astrology and read astrology, this is probably a time where I'm going to be like, I'm going to be very cautious about investments around this season between September and up until March. And so, maybe I don't focus so much on riskier investments. Things go more into safe investments. And, I have some cash on hand, physical cash, or maybe I purchase something that will be universally exchangeable anywhere, like, some food, land, that type of thing. Okay. And again, I'm watching more than anything else, because these indicators are just indicators. They don't necessarily say anything's written in stone. Okay, now I'm actually going to show you how some crypto astrology has been very interesting. So this is something that happened around Terra Luna's crash. So Will Clemente, who's a very young but brilliantly talented Bitcoin on-chain analyst, he doesn't believe anything about astrology, but he saw this and he's like, what kind of sorcery is this? And Marin, who's a very, she's very sort of flamboyant, dark, she kind of irritates me, but she does call some things right. She's an astrologer who focuses on crypto. And on the 21st of January this year, she said, May 10th and October 28th, do what you will. And this is what happened on May 10th. She was calling a lunar eclipse season. So we can't just say it's one day, it's sort of a range of days, but calling this in January. And then this is what happened around May 10th. This is when Terra Luna collapsed. We went from 40,000 Bitcoin to like 25,000. It lost 40% of its value during this eclipse season, during this period. So to have an astrologer be able to just look at the astrological charts and make that prediction is very, very powerful, because technical analysts, fundamental analysts, they were caught blindsided by this. So that's an example of a longer term thing that was predicted. And October 28th, interestingly enough, correlates somewhere in here. Now, this isn't just Bitcoin, by the way. This is the next eclipse season that's happening this year. And it's between Taurus and Scorpio, which has to do with personal resources, our resources, and other people's resources. So this is very much the resource axis that's going to be highlighted during this eclipse season. Again, another strong indicator pointing us in the direction that astrology is saying something's going to happen around this period of time, and it's probably not going to be, too positive. All right, moving on here. Now, this is on a daily chart. So this is on the 7th of, and I'm going to show you a little bit about how I use this stuff, because I do my own interpretation. I have Solar Fire, but I check in with other astrologers. And so Cryptodamus on Twitter, I follow him because he's made some interesting calls. And here he said, Mars trines Bitcoin's Pluto in about 1 to 2 hours. It could provide a nice short trade entry. The next few days could be rough, and a short could be profitable, but use a decent stop loss in case. So he said it's only going to be a short-term pump, and then it's going to reverse in 1 to 2 hours. And this is when he tweeted it. 2 hours later, lo and behold, Bitcoin's pumping. And people probably got excited. Actually, they did get excited, and they said, oh my goodness, Bitcoin's saved forever and we're going to keep pumping off into oblivion, and it faded. So exactly what he was saying played out. And he's actually got an interesting prediction today. This is from the 10th, but it's actually for later today. And he's talking about what I was talking about, the Mars trining Bitcoin's Mars late Tuesday into Wednesday, which is likely to bring another fake out pump. Fade that for perfect short entry. So what fading means is where you buy in, you ride the pump out, and then you get out. So it's a very short-term trade, because he's saying we're probably going to see another one of these, and they're probably going to see a sharp correction. And that's just what the astrology is saying. So this really has to be taken into consideration with a bunch of other indicators, and I'm definitely not putting much into this. I'm sort of looking at this more as an observer and just maybe going small amounts at this time, especially into other people's interpretations, because ultimately, when I follow my own gut, when I follow my own charts and my own indicators and my own interpretation of astrology altogether, that's when I make the best decisions. When I listen to other people, it never works out. It's not just Murphy's Law, by the way. Whenever there's consensus on something in finances, you should probably be contrarian. Go against the herd, because the markets are made to trick most of the participants. So an easy way is to just counter trade what most people believe. So I did say that I was going to give you another technique, but before that, I wanted to just talk a little bit about sort of my own journey with crypto astrology over the last little while, because it's been very interesting, actually. So since Terra, Celsius, and Three Arrows Capital, they're all related, by the way, but since that crash back in May, that was, right during eclipse season, the one that I showed you in the charts that Marin predicted, we saw massive crypto deleveraging, and then the contagion spread, and Celsius went down, Three Arrows Capital went insolvent, and it created huge problems. And now we're sitting at like a $20,000 Bitcoin. So it made me switch my personal strategy. Before that all happened, I was doing well as a full-time yield farmer. So I was basically staking, earning rewards, and not really trading at all. I used to trade 2 years ago, and then said, hey, I don't really want to be doing this often. I'd rather just basically sit back and chill. So yield farming was great. But after these incidences, it kind of spread throughout all of DeFi, and a lot of DeFi protocols went bankrupt, and it was just, DeFi wasn't a safe place, and my gut was telling me the same thing. So basically, I took whatever dust I had left over from all my altcoins and converted it into stable coins, and I put it on Bybit, which is an exchange that doesn't have KYC, really, really low fees, and it's super easy to use. I love the interface there. So that's why I went with Bybit as opposed to Binance, that is like fully KYC'd. And if you want to actually, I'm going to be doing some stuff using Bybit, more videos and stuff. So if you want to try Bybit yourself, I've actually got a referral link in the description below. And if you use it and you fund it and you start trading a little bit, we both kind of get kickbacks from that. So you get a little bit and I get a little bit. So it's a nice little perk. You don't have to use Bybit, but if you choose to, there is a referral link for you. So I then started trading basically on Bybit, using sort of what I'd learned a couple of years ago. But the market didn't have any clear direction. Nobody knew it was going to happen. It was kind of hard to chart. It was like a wait and see, and I was making mistakes. I can identify general trends, but I couldn't really figure out the timing too well. And there's a saying that everybody says, don't try and time the markets. Well, turns out most people aren't astrologers. But in truth, astrology doesn't really time the markets for us either. It gives us instead something that's rare, and that's what's called a forward indicator. Most indicators are lagging, so they tell us about something that's already happened, and then we try to figure out what happens next based on an indicator that told us what already happened. So forward indicators are extremely rare. Forward indicators might be like insider news that hasn't reached, it's like a rumor or something like that. But another one, astrology is a very powerful forward indicator. It doesn't always work out. It doesn't always correlate perfectly, but if you take a look at it and you use it and you see which aspects make the biggest difference, you have to do a bit of back testing. And back testing is where you sort of, you say, okay, this aspect, when does it happen before? What happened last time it happened? What happened the time before that? And so when you do a bit of back testing, you're able to figure out sort of which aspects have more of a correlation and which ones don't. So in conjunction with charting, I've started to use financial astrology techniques to come up with a potential narrative for the next year. And then basically use the smaller aspects, or the ones, the inner planets, to maybe, do some shorter term day trades. And they've actually worked out quite nicely. So here, let me just, I'm going to show you a bit of my own trading journal here. So this is basically what I got. So I've been trading over the last 26 days. This is probably a better view, using this specific technique. And I had a good day off the bat, and then it went really slow, and then I lost 5% of my my portfolio, and then I lost another 2%. And I took a couple of days off trading. It wasn't really going well. And then I started to use the astrology stuff more. And you can see, since I started to use the astrology stuff, I haven't had a losing day. I've actually had days that all ended in the green or ended positively. And so even with the days of loss that happened earlier on when I was sort of not using the astrology or not using it correctly, at the end, I actually have a 25.7% uptick in 26 days of trading. And if you compound that for a year, that would be like 2,266%. So that could turn 1 Bitcoin into 22.7 Bitcoins if I was trading Bitcoin. So it's been working well. I'm not saying it's going to work like that for a year. Obviously, on paper, things work well. And in practice, on a short time frame, they can work well. But I'll have to see. I'll have to, connect back with everyone on how it turns out towards the end of the year after I've been doing this. And you don't have to day trade either. It's just something that I've been doing as an experiment for fun. And it has been working out. This has actually been working out quite nicely. And like I said, it's a bit of using intuitive indicators, a little bit of financial astrology, technical analysis, and then some just good risk management in there as well. Risk management is sort of knowing when to get in, when to get out, when to add more, when to take profits, that type of thing. So the astrology part really did turn around my trading. Up here in this part, trading was very, slightly positively correlated, but it was really in the second half of this 26-day period that when I used the astrology that it really brought it forward. So I'm very grateful for that, and grateful to have found something that works. And I must say, this is very personalized. There's a million different ways to trade, a million different ways to invest, and finding one that personally works for you might not work for somebody else, but if it works for you, that's great. And so I just wanted to let you know that, the astrology stuff does actually work when I put it into practice. Now, I did want to also tell you about another really cool thing that you can do. So I'm going to keep it super easy because my strategy is, it's a little bit more complicated because I've been working with it over a period of time. And oftentimes, if we start with something that's simple, manageable, and we're using small amounts, and then it grows as we get comfortable into something that's more complicated with larger amounts, that's good. As opposed to starting out with something that's too complicated and using a large amount and then getting totally wrecked with it. So the thing I'm going to show you is something you can use to, buy Bitcoin, and it really works out very nicely. And in addition to that, actually, Micah and Vanessa are going to put together a little workshop specifically for women on how to actually apply this. So it's really cool. They're doing this. I'm just showing you. It's called Empowering Women Financially. Michael will put a link up in the chat for that. But I'll show you what the strategy is, and you can see if this is something that you might want to learn. And it actually has to deal with the cycles of the moon. Isn't that cool? So there's a correlation in astrology and in cryptocurrency where full moons generally, not always, generally, are local bottoms. So the price will dump into a full moon, and we got one coming up in a few days. What does that mean? Price is probably going down, just like that Cryptodama said. And then what happens towards a new moon? It pumps. So pumping into a new moon, forming a local high, and then the price dumps into a full moon. Now, this is not a perfect correlation, and there has been plenty of times where a new moon, it's dumped after a new moon even more. But overall, like if you take this over a 52-week period or a year period, generally, if you were to invest in the full moon and take your profits on the new moon, you would be up quite a bit. Now, if you were looking to get into Bitcoin for a long-term hold, what you could do, that's a very great strategy, is you can take whatever you want to invest, and let's say it's $10,000, split it up over a year. So take $800 at a time and deposit that $800 and buy Bitcoin every full moon for a year. And what you're doing is you're actually averaging at the local lows. And so I've talked a little bit about dollar cost averaging. It's a great strategy because it averages and it kind of smooths out crypto's volatility. And you don't end up buying when the price is too overextended. You might actually catch some of these troughs, and it brings the average price down very, very nicely. And so I would highly recommend to take a look at this and take a look at Vanessa and Micah's workshop as well on how to do that, because that's one thing that they're going to cover. This is really easy, and it's kind of fun too, because it actually has to deal with a natural cycle that affects Bitcoin's price. So it has to deal with the moon cycle, and it has to deal with Bitcoin, and it's very easy to follow. You don't actually need a chart. The charts just show us that this thing works. So yeah, I thought I'd share that strategy with you. And this is one that, I think is anybody can kind of understand that wants to get into working with crypto. Now, for people who are a little bit savvy and want to maybe find a strategy that, creates more profit and begin working with trading and crypto astrology and all of these things, I do have a trading workshop that's coming up. There it is. It is that's the link for it. And again, I'm going to show you sort of the landing page for it. We've created, it's on July 16th from 4 to 7 p.m. British Standard Time, or British Summer Time, sorry. You can check your local time. But we're going to cover what is trading, the psychology and state of being of successful traders, how to build and structure a trading-specific portfolio, which exchanges are best, the different types of trading explained, a little bit about technical analysis and how to follow trading signals. And you know what? I think I'm going to throw in a little bit about the astrology in there as well, because I think it's such a cool thing that I use. But I won't give an extensive discussion on that. It's a lot to fit in for 3 hours. Basically, you've got this really nice presentation you can always come back to, where I sort of actually break it down for you and how the whole thing works. All right, so I'm going to jump into some questions now, and let's take a look at what we got. So Kathy, thoughts on how to look at gold or silver? I own different coins, so would the coin year be part of the charting? Yeah, that's interesting. Because gold and silver have obviously been around since time immemorial, and they wouldn't really have a birth chart that we could easily find, because they're so old and probably we couldn't even find their origin really. So that would be an interesting one to look at. How do you actually take a look at gold, or how do you look at silver? So there might be another correlation, like the way that we assign value to gold or the value to silver. That might be one. Maybe there's like a trading index for gold or silver that's more modern, that you could use that trading index as the natal chart for it. And Kenai is saying, interesting that full moons are shown as darker than the new moons. I would think the full moons would be brighter and new moons darker. I know. And that's what kind of messed me up when I first looked at that. I'm like, how come the full moons are darker and the new moons are brighter? So I had to kind of get used to that. And maybe whoever made the trading view indicator was a tech guy and not an astrologer, and didn't realize that. Yeah. So interesting observation as well. And yeah, so if there's any more questions, please let me know. It's a lot of fun doing this presentation today. So Hannah's saying, we saw transit Mars running into transit Uranus, probably end of this month, in Taurus, Bitcoin's horoscope. Since Taurus is related to possession, luxury, what does this mean for Bitcoin? So the transiting Mars running into the transiting Uranus, that could be, Mars being sort of an initiatory force, or a violent sort of adjustment, in Uranus, of course, being shocking. That could mean something unexpected happening. But if they're both transiting aspects that are doing this, then it's going to be more global. It's going to not be sort of focused on Bitcoin. Again, I'd have to take a look at where that aspect actually hit on Bitcoin's chart and which aspects it forms, to see how it would be highlighting or showing up specifically for Bitcoin. But yeah, I can say that Mars, conjuncting Uranus would be potentially a time of unrest, sudden shocking occurrences with a lot of force. Good observation there, by the way. All right. So Thank you very much. And one other thing too is if you want to stay updated on all the things that are happening, I'd highly recommend joining our Telegram group. The link is in the description below, along with the links for empowering women financially, as well as the links for the trading workshop and for Bybit. They're all down there in the description below. You can go and click them. But yes, stay up to date on Telegram, as I tend to post everything I do in that thread, and you can just click the link and get yourself to anything that we might be doing in the future. So huge thank you to coming out and watching this today. This was a real pleasure to present on this topic. It's something that I'm very passionate about and very excited about. And yeah, I just wanted to share it with everybody in this amazing community. So thank you for joining, and I will see you all next Tuesday. Next Tuesday, we have guests, Martin and Marie Richfeld, and we're going to be talking about natural conception. So a bit of a departure from Bitcoin finance and all that kind of stuff. And we're going to be talking about all sorts of cool stuff related to bodily wisdom, pleasure, and natural conception, which all seem to go together. And we're going to find out why next week. Take care.
This is Octave Leap. Innovation, regeneration, and human optimization.